The outside and the inside asterisk on the one hand, true to the Western tradition that controls not only in theory but in practice, in the principle of its practice, the relationships between speech and writing, Saussure does not recognize in the latter more than a narrow and derivative function. Narrow because it is nothing but one modality among others, a modality of the events which can befall a language whose essence, as the facts seem to show, can remain forever uncontaminated by writing. Language does have an oral tradition that is independent of routine, Cours de linguistique générale, p. 46. Derivative because representative, signifier of the first signifier, representation of the self-present voice, of the immediate, natural, and direct signification of the meaning, of the signified, of the concept, of the ideal object or what have you. Saussure takes up the traditional definition of writing which, already in Plato and Aristotle, was restricted to the model of phonetic script and the language of words. Let us recall the Aristotelian definition: spoken words are the symbols of mental experience and written words are the symbols of spoken words. S.A. Usher, language and writing are two distinct systems of signs, the second exists for the sole purpose of representing the first, p. 45, italics added, p. 23t. This representative determination, beside communicating without a doubt essentially with the idea of the sign, does not translate a choice or an evaluation, does not betray a psychological or metaphysical presupposition peculiar to Saussure, it describes or rather reflects the structure of a certain type of writing, phonetic writing, which we use and within whose element the episteme in general, science and philosophy, and linguistics in particular, could be founded. One should, moreover, say model rather than structure. It is not a question of a system constructed and functioning perfectly, but of an ideal explicitly directing a functioning which in fact is never completely phonetic. In fact, but also for reasons of essence to which I shall frequently return. To be sure, this factum of phonetic writing is massive, it commands our entire culture and our entire science, and it is certainly not just one fact asterisk. The title of the next section is The Outside L, the Inside, 65, 44. In French, is, est, and et, sound the same. For Derrida's discussion of the complicity between supplementation, and the copula, is, see particularly Le Supplement de Copule, La Philosophie devant la Linguistique, MP, pp. 209-46. T hereafter page numbers in parenthesis refer to the original work and those in brackets to the translation. 1i. Linguistics and Grammatology among others. Nevertheless, it does not respond to any necessity of an absolute and universal essence. Using this as a point of departure, Saussure defines the project and object of general linguistics. The linguistic object is not defined by the combination of the written word and the spoken word. The spoken form alone constitutes the object. P. 45, italics added, LPP 23-241. The form O at the question to which he responded thus entailed the response. It was a matter of knowing what sort of word is the object of linguistics and what the relationships are between the atomic unities that are the written and the spoken word. Now the word, vox, is already a unity of sense and sound, of concept and voice, or, to speak a more rigorously Saussurean language, of the signified and the signifier. This last terminology was moreover first proposed in the domain of spoken language alone, of linguistics in the narrow sense and not in the domain of semiology. I propose to retain the word sign signa to designate the whole and to replace concept and sound image respectively by signified signify and signifier signify in p. 99 post 67. The word is thus already a constituted unity, an effect of the somewhat mysterious fact that thought sound implies divisions, p. 156, po. 112. Even if the word is in its turn articulated, even if it implies other divisions, as long as one poses the question of the relationships between speech and writing in the light of the indivisible units of the thought sound, there will always be the ready response. Writing will be phonetic, it will be the outside, the exterior representation of language and of this thought sound. It must necessarily operate from already constituted units of signification, in the formation of which it has played no part. Perhaps the objection will be made that writing up to the present has not only not contradicted, but indeed confirmed the linguistics of the word. Hitherto I seem to have maintained that the fascination of the unit called word has prevented giving to writing the attention that it merited. By that I seem to suppose that, by ceasing to accord an absolute privilege to the word, modern linguistics would become that much more attentive to writing and would finally cease to regard it with suspicion. André Martinet comes to the opposite conclusion. In his study The Word, he describes the necessity that contemporary linguistics obeys when it is led, if not to dispense everywhere with the concept of the word, at least to make its usage more flexible, to associate it with the concepts of smaller or greater units, monemes or symptoms. In accrediting and consolidating the division of language into words in certain areas of linguistics, writing would thus have encouraged classical linguistics in its prejudices. Writing would have constructed or at least condensed the screen of the word. What a contemporary linguist can say of the word well illustrates the general revision of traditional concepts that the functionalist and structuralist research of the last 35 years had to undertake in order to give a scientific basis to the observation and description of languages. Certain applications of linguistics, like the researches relating to mechanical translation, by the emphasis they place on the written form of language, could make us believe in the fundamental importance of the divisions of the written text and make us forget that one must always start with the oral utterance in order to understand the real nature of human language. Also, it is more than ever indispensable to insist on the necessity of pushing the examination beyond the immediate appearances and the structures most familiar to the researcher. It is behind the screen of the word that the truly fundamental characteristics of human language often appear. One cannot but subscribe to this caution. Yet it must always be recognized that it throws suspicion only on a certain type of writing, phonetic writing conforming to the empirically determined and practiced divisions of ordinary oral language. The processes of mechanical translation to which it alludes conform similarly to that spontaneous practice. Beyond that model and that concept of writing, this entire demonstration must, it seems, be reconsidered. For it remains trapped in the Saussurean limitation that we are attempting to explore. In effect, Saussure limits the number of systems of writing to two, both defined as system of representation of the oral language, either representing words in a synthetic and global manner, or representing phonetically the elements of sounds constituting words. There are only two systems of writing. 1. In an ideographic system each word is represented by a single sign that is unrelated to the component sounds of the word itself. Each written sign stands for a whole word and, indirectly, for the idea expressed by the word. The classic example of an ideographic system of writing is Chinese. 2. The system commonly known as phonetic tries to reproduce the succession of sounds that make up a word. Phonetic systems are sometimes syllabic, sometimes alphabetic, I.e., based on the irreducible elements of speech. Moreover, ideographic systems freely become mixtures when certain ideograms lose their original value and become symbols of isolated sounds. P. 47, pp. 25-26. This limitation is at bottom justified, in Saussure's eyes, by the notion of the arbitrariness of the sign. Writing being defined as a system of signs, there is no symbolic writing, in the Saussurean sense, no figurative writing, there is no writing as long as graphism keeps a relationship of natural figuration and of some resemblance to what is then not signified but represented, drawn, etc. The concept of pictographic or natural writing would therefore be contradictory for Saussure. If one considers the now recognized fragility of the notions of pictogram, ideogram, etc., and the uncertainty of the frontiers between so-called pictographic, ideographic, linguistics and grammatology 3.3 and phonetic scripts, one realizes not only the unwiseness of the Saussurean limitation but the need for general linguistics to abandon an entire family of concepts inherited from metaphysics, often through the incendiary of a psychology and clustering around the concept of arbitrariness. All this refers, beyond the nature/culture opposition, to a supervening opposition between physis and nomos, physis and techne, whose ultimate function is perhaps to derive historicity, and, paradoxically, not to recognize the rights of history, production, institutions, etc., except in the form of the arbitrary and in the substance of naturalism. But let us keep that question provisionally open. Perhaps this gesture, which in truth presides over metaphysics, is also inscribed in the concept of history and even in the concept of time. In addition, Saussure introduces another massive limitation. I shall limit discussion to the phonetic system and especially to the one used today, the system that stems from the Greek alphabet, P48, P026. These two limitations are all the more reassuring because they are just what we need at a specific point to fulfill the most legitimate of exigencies. In fact, the condition for the scientificity of linguistics is that the field of linguistics have hard and fast frontiers, that it be a system regulated by an internal necessity, and that in a certain way its structure be closed. The representativist concept of writing facilitate things. If writing is nothing but the figuration, P44, Po23 of the language, one has the right to exclude it from the interiority of the system, for it must be believed that there is an inside of the language, as the image may be excluded without damage from the system of reality. Proposing as his theme the representation of language by writing, Saussure thus begins by positing that writing is unrelated to the inner system of language, P44, Po23. External/internal, image/reality, representation/presence, such is the old grid to which is given the task of outlining the domain of a science. And of what science? Of a science that can no longer answer to the classical concept of the episteme because the originality of its field and originality that it inaugurates is that the opening of the image within it appears as the condition of reality, a relationship that can no longer be thought within the simple difference and the uncompromising exteriority of image and reality, of outside and inside, of appearance and essence, with the entire system of oppositions which necessarily follows from it. Plato, who said basically the same thing about the relationship between writing, speech, and being, or idea, had at least a more subtle, more critical, and less complacent theory of image, painting, and imitation than the one that presides over the birth of Saussurean linguistics. It is not by chance that the exclusive consideration of phonetic writing permits a response to the exigencies of the internal system. The basic functional principle of phonetic writing is precisely to respect and protect the integrity of the internal system of the language, even if in fact it does not succeed in doing so. The Saussurean limitation does not respond, by a mere happy convenience, to the scientific exigency of the internal system. That exigency is itself constituted, as the epistemological exigency in general, by the very possibility of phonetic writing and by the exteriority of the notation to internal logic. But let us not simplify. On that point Saussure too is not quite complacent. Why else would he give so much attention to that external phenomenon, that exiled figuration, that outside, that double? Why does he judge it impossible to simply disregard, literally make abstraction of what is nevertheless designated as the abstract itself with respect to the inside of language? Writing, though unrelated to its inner system, is used continually to represent language. We cannot simply disregard it. We must be acquainted with its usefulness, shortcomings, and dangers. P44, P23 writing would thus have the exteriority that one attributes to utensils, to what is even an imperfect tool and a dangerous, almost maleficent, technique. One understands better why, instead of treating this exterior figuration in an appendix or marginally, one Saussure devotes so laborious a chapter to it almost at the beginning of the course. It is less a question of outlining than of protecting, and even of restoring the internal system of the language in the purity of its concept against the gravest, most perfidious, most permanent contamination which has not ceased to menace, even to corrupt that system, in the course of what Saussure strongly wishes, in spite of all opposition, to consider as an external history, as a series of accidents affecting the language and befalling it from without, at the moment of notation, P45, Po24, as if writing began and ended with notation. Already in the Phaedrus, Plato says that the evil of writing comes from without, 27 essay. The contamination by writing, the fact, or the thread of it, are denounced in the accents of the moralist or preacher by the linguist from Geneva. The tone counts. It is as if, at the moment when the modern science of the logos would come into its autonomy and its scientificity, it became necessary again to attack a heresy. This tone began to make itself heard when, at the moment of already tying the episteme and the logos within the same possibility, the Phaedrus denounced writing as the intrusion of an artful technique, a forced entry of a totally original sort, an archetypal violence, eruption of the outside within the inside, breaching into the interiority of the soul, the living self-presence of the soul within the true logos, the help that speech lends to itself. Thus incensed, Saussure's vehement argumentation aims at more than a theoretical error, more than a moral fault, at a sort of stain and primarily at a sin. Sin has been defined often among others by Malebranche and by Kant as the inversion of the natural relationship between the soul and the body through passion. Saussure here points at the inversion of the natural relationship linguistics and grammatology 3.5 between speech and writing. It is not a simple analogy. Writing, the letter, the sensible inscription, has always been considered by Western tradition as the body and matter external to the spirit, to breath, to speech, and to the logos. And the problem of soul and body is no doubt derived from the problem of writing, from which it seems conversely to borrow its metaphors. Writing, sensible matter and artificial exteriority, a clothing. It has sometimes been contested that speech clothed thought. Husserl, Saussure, Lavelle have all questioned it. But has it ever been doubted that writing was the clothing of speech? For Saussure it is even a garment of perversion and debauchery, a dress of corruption and disguise, a festival mask that must be exorcised, that is to say warded off, by the good word. Writing veils the appearance of language, it is not a guise for language but a disguise. P51, Po30. Strange image. One already suspects that if writing is image and exterior figuration, this representation is not innocent. The outside bears with the inside a relationship that is, as usual, anything but simple exteriority. The meaning of the outside was always present within the inside, imprisoned outside the outside, and vice versa. Thus a science of language must recover the natural, that is, the simple and original relationships between speech and writing, that is, between an inside and an outside. It must restore its absolute youth, and the purity of its origin, short of a history and a fall which would have perverted the relationships between outside and inside. Therefore there would be a natural order of relationships between linguistic and graphic signs, and it is the theoretician of the arbitrariness of the sign who reminds us of it. According to the historico-metaphysical presuppositions evoked above, there would be first a natural bond of sense to the senses, and it is this that passes from sense to sound. The natural bond, Saussure says, the only true bond, the bond of sound, P46 Po25. This natural bond of the signified, concept or sense, to the phonic signifier would condition the natural relationship subordinating writing, visible image, to speech. It is this natural relationship that would have been inverted by the original sin of writing. The graphic form image manages to force itself upon them at the expense, F sound, and the natural sequence is reversed, P47, Po 25. Malebranche explained original sin as inattention, the temptation of ease and idleness, by that nothing that was Adam's distraction, alone culpable before the innocence of the divine word, the latter exerted no force, no efficacy, since nothing had taken place. Here too, one gave in to ease, which is curiously, but as usual, on the side of technical artifice and not within the bent of the natural movement thus thwarted or deviated. First, the graphic form image of word strikes us as being something permanent and stable, better suited than sound to constitute the unity of language throughout time. Though it creates a purely fictitious unity, the superficial bond of writing is much easier to grasp than the natural bond, the only true bond, the bond of sound, P46, italics added, P25. That the graphic form of word strikes us as being something permanent and stable, better suited than sound to constitute the unity of language throughout time, is that not a natural phenomenon too? In fact, a bad nature, superficial and fictitious and easy, effaces a good nature by imposture, that which ties sense to sound, the thought sound. Saussure is faithful to the tradition that has always associated writing with the fatal violence of the political institution. It is clearly a matter, as with Rousseau for example, of a break with nature, of a usurpation that was coupled with the theoretical blindness to the natural essence of language, at any rate to the natural bond between the instituted signs of the voice and the first language of man, the cry of nature, second discourse. Asterisk Saussure, but the spoken word is so intimately bound to its written image that the latter manages to usurp the main role, P45, italics added, P024. Rousseau, writing is nothing but the representation of speech, it is bizarre that one gives more care to the determining of the image than to the object. Saussure, whoever says that a certain letter must be pronounced a certain way is mistaking the written image of a sound for the sound itself. One attributes the oddity bizarre to an exceptional pronunciation, P52, Po 30.2. What is intolerable and fascinating is indeed the intimacy intertwining image and thing, graph, i.e., and phone, to the point where by a mirroring, inverting, and perverting effect, speech seems in its turn the speculum of writing, which manages to usurp the main role. Representation mingles with what it represents, to the point where one speaks as one writes, one thinks as if the represented were nothing more than the shadow or reflective of the representer. A dangerous promiscuity and a nefarious complicity between the reflection and the reflected which lets itself be seduced narcissistically. In this play of representation, the point of origin becomes ungraspable. There are things like reflecting pools, and images, an infinite reference from one to the other, but no longer a source, a spring. There is no longer a simple origin. For what is reflected is split in itself and not only as an addition to itself of its image. The reflection, the image, the double, splits what it doubles. The origin of the speculation becomes a difference. Yat can look at itself is not one, and the law of the addition of the origin to its representation, of the thing to its image, is that 1 + 1 makes at least 3. The asterisk discards sur l'origine et les fondements de l'inégalité. Derrida's references are to the P. Elchit edition, vol. 3 mine, placed within brackets, to a discourse on the origin of inequality, the social contract and discourses, TRCDH. Cole, London, 1913. Our linguistics and grammatology 3-7 historical usurpation and theoretical oddity that install the image within the rights of reality are determined as the forgetting of a simple origin. By Rousseau but also for Saussure. The displacement is hardly anagrammatic, the result is that people forget that they learn to speak before they learn to write and the natural sequence is reversed, P47, Po 25. The violence of forgetting. Writing, a mnemotechnic means, supplanting good memory, spontaneous memory, signifies forgetfulness. It is exactly what Plato said in the Phaedrus, comparing writing to speech as hypomnesis to onemi, the auxiliary aid memoir to the living memory. Forgetfulness because it is a mediation and a departure of the logos from itself. Without writing, the latter would remain in itself. Writing is the dissimulation of the natural, primary, and immediate presence of essence to the soul within the logos. Its violence befalls the soul as unconsciousness. Deconstructing this tradition will therefore not consist of reversing it, of making writing innocent. Rather of showing why the violence of writing does not befall an innocent language. There is an originary violence of writing because language is first, in a sense I shall gradually reveal, writing. Usurpation has already begun. The sense of the right side appears in a mythological effect of return. The sciences and the arts have elected to live within this violence, their progress has consecrated forgetfulness and corrupted manners moors. Saussure again anagrammatizes Rousseau, the literary language adds to the undeserved importance of writing. Thus writing assumes undeserved importance unimportance a laquelle and a padroit, P47, Po 25. When linguists become embroiled in a theoretical mistake in this subject, when they are taken in, they are culpable, their fault is above all moral, they have yielded to imagination, to sensibility, to passion, they have fallen into the trap, P46, Po 25 of writing, have let themselves be fascinated by the influence prestige of the written form, ibid, of that custom, that second nature. The language does have a definite and stable oral tradition that is independent of writing, but the influence prestige of the written form prevents our seeing this. We are thus not blind to the visible, but blinded be the visible, dazzled by writing. The first linguists confused language and writing, just as the humanists had done before them. Even Bob. His immediate successors fell into the same trap. Rousseau had already addressed the same reproach to the grammarians. For the grammarians, the art of speech seems to be verb little more than the art of writing. 3 As usual, the trap is artifice dissimulated in nature. This explains why the course in general linguistics treats first this strange external system that is writing. As necessary preamble to restoring the natural to itself, one must first disassemble the trap. We read a little further on, to substitute immediately what is natural for what is artificial would be necessary, but this is impossible without first studying the sounds of what is language, detached from their graphic signs. Sounds represent only vague notions, and the prop provided by writing, though deceptive, is still preferable. The first linguists, who knew nothing about the physiology of articulated sounds, were constantly falling into a trap. To let go of the letter was for them to lose their foothold. To me, it means a first step in the direction of truth, P55. Opening of the chapter on phonology, P032. For Saussure, to give into the prestige of the written form is, as I have just said, to give into passion. It is passion and I weigh my word that Saussure analyzes and criticizes here, as a moralist and a psychologist of a very old tradition. As one knows, passion is tyrannical and enslaving, philological criticism is still deficient on one point, it follows the written language slavishly and neglects the living language, P14, pages 1-2. The tyranny of writing, Saussure says elsewhere, P53, Po 31. That tyranny is at bottom the mastery of the body over the soul, and passion is a passivity and sickness of the soul, the moral perversion is pathological. The reciprocal effect of writing on speech is wrong because, Saussure says, such mistakes are really pathological, p53, po 31. The inversion of the natural relationships would thus have engendered the perverse cult of the letter image, sin of idolatry, superstition of the letters. Saussure says in the Anagrams 4 where he has difficulty in proving the existence of a phoneme anterior to all writing. The perversion of artifice engenders monsters. Writing, like all artificial languages one would wish to fix and remove from the living history of the natural language, participates in the monstrosity. It is a deviation from nature. The characteristic of the Leibnizian type and Esperanto would be here in the same position. Saussure's irritation with such possibilities drives him to pedestrian comparisons. A man proposing a fixed language that posterity would have to accept for what it is would be like a hen hatching a duck's egg, p111, po 76. And Saussure wishes to save not only the natural life of language, but the natural habits of writing. Spontaneous life must be protected. Thus, the introduction of scientific exigencies and the taste for exactitude into ordinary phonetic writing must be avoided. In this case, rationality would bring death, desolation, and monstrousness. That is why common orthography must be kept away from the notations of the linguist and the multiplying of diacritical signs must be avoided. Are there grounds for substituting a phonologic alphabet for a system L orthograph already in use? Here I can only broach this interesting subject. I think that phonological writing should be for the use of linguists only. First, how would it be possible to make the English, Germans, French, etc. adopt a uniform system? Next, an alphabet applicable to all languages would probably be weighed down by diacritical marks, and to say nothing of the distressing R linguistics and grammatology 39 appearance of a page of phonological writing attempts to gain precision would obviously confuse the reader by obscuring what the writing was designed to express. The advantages would not be sufficient to compensate for the inconveniences. Phonological exactitude is not very desirable outside science, p57, p34. I hope my intention is clear. I think Saussure's reasons are good. I do not question, on the level on which he says it, the truth of what Saussure says in such a tone. And as long as an explicit problematics, a critique of the relationships between speech and writing, is not elaborated, what he denounces as the blind prejudice of classical linguists or of common experience indeed remains a blind prejudice, on the basis of a general presupposition which is no doubt common to the accused and the prosecutor. I would rather announce the limits and the presuppositions of what seems here to be self-evident and what seems to me to retain the character and validity of evidence. The limits have already begun to appear. Why does a project of general linguistics, concerning the internal system in general of language in general, outline the limits of its field by excluding, as exteriority in general, a particular system of writing, however important it might be, even were ITTOVE in fact universal, 5. A particular system which has precisely for its principle or at least for its declared project to be exterior to the spoken language. Declaration of principle, pious wish, and historical violence of a speech dreaming its full self-presence, living itself as its own resumption, self-proclaimed language, auto-production of a speech declared alive, capable, Socrates said, of helping itself, a logos which believes itself to be its own father, being lifted thus above written discourse, infans, speechless, and infirm at not being able to respond when one questions it and which, since its parent's help is always needed, tou putros aei delta bold hophatris 275d, must therefore be born out of a primary gap and a primary expatriation, condemning it to wandering and blindness, to mourning. Self-proclaimed language but actually speech, deluded into believing itself completely alive, and violent, for it is not capable of protecting or defending itself, dunatos manamuna ioto, except through expelling the other, and especially its own other, throwing it outside and below, under the name of writing. But however important it might be, and were it in fact universal or called upon to become so, that particular model which is phonetic writing does not exist. No practice is ever totally faithful to its principle. Even before speaking, as I shall do further on, of a radical and a priori necessary infidelity, one can already remark its massive phenomena in mathematical script or in punctuation, in spacing in general, which it is difficult to consider as simple accessories of writing. That a speech supposedly alive can lend itself to spacing in its own writing is what relates it originarily to its own death. Finally, the usurpation of which Saussure speaks, the violence by which writing would substitute itself for its own for that which ought not only to have engendered it but to have been engendered from itself, such a reversal of power cannot be an accidental aberration. Usurpation necessarily refers us to a profound possibility of essence. This is without a doubt inscribed within speech itself, and he should have questioned it, perhaps even started from it. Saussure confronts the system of the spoken language with the system of phonetic, and even alphabetic writing as though with the telos of writing. This teleology leads to the interpretation of all eruptions of the non-phonetic within writing as transitory crisis and accident of passage, and it is right to consider this teleology to be a Western ethnocentrism, a premathematical primitivism, and a preformalist intuitionism. Even if this teleology responds to some absolute necessity, it should be problematized as such. The scandal of usurpation invites us expressly and intrinsically to do that. How was the trap and the usurpation possible? Saussure never replies to this question beyond a psychology of the passions or of the imagination, a psychology reduced to its most conventional diagrams. This best explains why all linguistics, a determined sector inside semiology, is placed under the authority and superiority of psychology. To determine the exact place of semiology is the task of the psychologist, p33, p016. The affirmation of the essential and natural bond between the phone and the sense, the privilege accorded to an order of signifier, which then becomes the major signified of all other signifiers, depend expressly, and in contradiction to the other levels of the essay Usherian discourse, upon the psychology of consciousness and of intuitive consciousness. What Saussure does not question here is the essential possibility of non-intuition. Like Husserl, Saussure determines this non-intuition teleologically as crisis. The empty symbolism of the written notation in mathematical technique, for example, is also for Husserlian intuitionism that which exiles us far from the clear evidence of the sense, that is to say from the full presence of the signified in its truth, and thus opens the possibility of crisis. This is indeed a crisis of the logos. Nevertheless, for Husserl, this possibility remains linked with the very moment of truth and the production of ideal objectivity. It has in fact an essential need for writing. Point 6 by one entire aspect of his text, Husserl makes us think that the negativity of the crisis is not a mere accident. But it is then the concept of crisis that should be suspect, by virtue of what ties it to a dialectical and teleological determination of negativity. On the other hand, to account for usurpation and the origin of passion, the classical and very superficial argument of the solid permanence of the written thing, not to be simply false, calls forth descriptions which are precisely no longer within the province of psychology. Psychology will never be able to accommodate within its space that which constitutes the absence of the signatory, to say nothing of the absence of the referent. Linguistics and Grammatology 4.1 writing is the name of these two absences. Besides, ISIT not contradictory to what is elsewhere affirmed about language having a definite and far more one stable oral tradition. THAT is independent of writing, p46, po 24 to explain the usurpation by means of writing's power of duration, by means of the durability of the substance of writing. If these two stabilities were of the same nature, and if the stability of the spoken language were superior and independent, the origin of writing, its prestige and its supposed harmfulness, would remain an inexplicable mystery. It seems then as if Saussure wishes at the same time to demonstrate the corruption of speech by writing, to denounce the harm that the latter does to the former, and to underline the inalterable and natural independence of language. Languages are independent of writing, p. 45, p. 24. Such is the truth of nature. And yet nature is affected from without by an overturning which modifies it in its interior, denatures it and obliges it to be separated from itself. Nature denaturing itself, being separated from itself, naturally gathering its outside into its inside, is catastrophe, a natural event that overthrows nature, or monstrosity, a natural deviation within nature. The function assumed in Rousseau's discourse by the catastrophe, as we shall see, is here delegated to monstrousness. Let us cite the entire conclusion of chapter 6 of the course, graphic representation of language, which must be compared to Rousseau's text on pronunciation, but the tyranny of writing goes even further. By imposing itself upon the masses, spelling influences and modifies language. This happens only in highly literary languages where written texts play an important role. Then visual images lead to wrong uses pronunciations, such mistakes are really pathological. Spelling practices cause mistakes in the pronunciation of many French words. For instance, there were two spellings for the surname Lefebvre, from Latin favor, one popular and simple, the other learned and etymological, Lefebvre and Lefebvre. Because B and U were not kept apart in the old system of writing, Lefebvre was read as Lefebvre, with a B that has never real existed and a U that was the result of ambiguity. Now, the latter form is actually pronounced, pp 53-54, p. 031. Where is the evil? One will perhaps ask. And what has been invested in the living word, that makes such aggressions of writing intolerable? What investment begins by determining the constant action of writing as a deformation and an aggression? What prohibition has thus been transgressed? Where is the sacrilege? Why should the mother tongue be protected from the operation of writing? Why determine that operation as a violence, and why should the transformation be only a deformation? Why should the mother tongue not have a history, or, what comes to the same thing, produce its own history in a perfectly natural, autistic, and domestic way, without ever being affected by any outside? Why wish to punish writing for a monstrous crime, to the point of wanting to reserve for it, even within scientific treatments, a special compartment that holds it at a distance? For it is indeed within a sort of intralinguistic leper colony that Saussure wants to contain and concentrate the problem of deformations through writing. And, in order to be convinced that he would take in very bad part the innocent questions that I have just asked for, after all Lefebvre is not a bad name and we can love this play, let us read the following. The passage below explains to us that the play is not natural, and its accents are pessimistic. Mispronunciations due to spelling will probably appear more frequently, and as time goes on, the number of useless letters pronounced by speakers will probably increase. As in Rousseau in the essay Me context, the capital is accused. Some Parisians already pronounce the T in sep femme 7 women. Strange example. The historical gap, for it is indeed history that one must stop in order to protect language from writing, will only widen. Darmstaedter foresees the day when even the last two letters of ink 20 will be pronounced truly an orthographic monstrosity. Such phonic deformations belong to language but do not stem from its natural functioning. They are due to an external influence. Linguistics should put them into a special compartment for observation. They are teratological cases, p. 54, italics added, pp. 31-32. It is clear that the concepts of stability, permanence, and duration, which here assist thinking the relationships between speech and writing, are too lax and open to every uncritical investiture. They would require more attentive and minute analyses. The same is applicable to an explanation according to which most people pay more attention to visual impressions simply because these are sharper and more lasting than oral impressions, p. 46, po. 25j. This explanation of usurpation is not only empirical in its form, it is problematic in its content. It refers to a metaphysics and to an old physiology of sensory faculties constantly disproved by science, as by the experience of language and by the body proper as language. It imprudently makes of visibility the tangible, simple, and essential element of writing. Above all, in considering the audible as the natural milieu within which language must naturally fragment and articulate its instituted signs, thus exercising its arbitrariness, this explanation excludes all possibility of some natural relationship between speech and writing at the very moment that it affirms it. Instead of deliberately dismissing the notions of nature and institution that it constantly uses, which ought to be done first, it thus confuses the two. It finally and most importantly contradicts the principal affirmation according to which the thing that constitutes language one essential de la langue one is unrelated to the phonic character of the linguistic sign, p21, po 7j. This affirmation will soon our linguistics and grammatology 4.3 occupy us. Within it the other side of the Saussurian proposition denouncing the illusions of script comes to the fore. What do these limits and presuppositions signify? First, that a linguistics is not general as long as it defines its outside and inside in terms of determined linguistic models, as long as it does not rigorously distinguish essence from fact in their respective degrees of generality. The system of writing in general is not exterior to the system of language in general, unless it is granted that the division between exterior and interior passes through the interior of the interior or the exterior of the exterior, to the point where the immanence of language is essentially exposed to the intervention of forces that are apparently alien to its system. For the same reason, writing in general is not image or figuration of language in general, except if the nature, the logic, and the functioning of the image within the system from which one wishes to exclude it be reconsidered. Writing is not a sign of a sign, except if one says it of all signs, which would be more profoundly true. If every sign refers to a sign, and if sign of a sign signifies writing, certain conclusions which I shall consider at the appropriate moment will become inevitable. What Saussure saw without seeing, knew without being able to take into account, following in that the entire metaphysical tradition, is that a certain model of writing was necessarily but provisionally imposed, but for the inaccuracy in principle, insufficiency of fact, and the permanent usurpation, as instrument and technique of representation of a system of language. And that this movement, unique in style, was so profound that it permitted the thinking, within language, of concepts like those of the sign, technique, representation, language. The system of language associated with phonetic alphabetic writing is that within which logocentric metaphysics, determining the sense of being as presence, has been produced. This logocentrism, this epoch of the full speech, has always placed in parenthesis, suspended, and suppressed for essential reasons, all free reflection on the origin and status of writing, all science of writing which was not technology and the history of a technique, itself leaning upon a mythology and a metaphor of a natural writing. It is this logocentrism which, limiting the internal system of language in general by a bad abstraction, prevents Saussure and the majority of his successors 7 from determining fully and explicitly that which is called the integral and concrete object of linguistics, p. 23, po. 7. But conversely, as I announced above, it is when he is not expressly dealing with writing, when he feels he has closed the parenthesis on that subject, that Saussure opens the field of a general grammatology. which would not only no longer be excluded from general linguistics, but would dominate it and contain it within itself. Then one realizes that what was chased off limits, the wandering outcast of linguistics, has indeed never ceased to haunt language as its primary and most intimate possibility. Then something which was never spoken and which is nothing other than writing itself as the origin of language writes itself within Saussure's discourse. Then we glimpse the germ of a profound but indirect explanation of the usurpation and the traps condemned in chapter 6. This explanation will overthrow even the form of the question to which it was a premature reply. Asterisk a play on epoch, and epoche, the Husserlian term for the bracketing or putting out a play that constitutes phenomenological reduction.